Don Carson needs little introduction to us. There's more written about him on page 13 in the journal. But I guess all of us have climbed onto the shoulders of the Don. We value his preaching, his more than 50 books. Don, we're so grateful to you for your leadership, your scholarship, your judicious care, your loyalty to the gospel, to the scriptures, and to ordinary pastors. So please, Don, come now and preach the cross to us in our first session from study to pulpit.
It is an enormous privilege for me to join you in this way. I don't remember what year my first EMA was, but something like 40 years ago. And it's wonderful to see how the ministry has flourished in different locations across the years, and with not a few old friends staring back at me. It's wonderful to be home. As is usual in John's Gospel, John presents his material, in this case, the Passion narrative, John 18 and 19, as if it were a pool in which a child may wade and an elephant may swim. On the one hand, the material is simple, straightforward, dramatic, clear. On the other hand, as we'll see, it's subtle, interwoven with themes from the rest of the book, theologically profound, symbol-laden, evocative, and tied through the strands of biblical theology to massive themes that run right through Holy Scripture. Moreover, it pleased God in giving us 4 Gospels to include in each Gospel a quite distinctive passion narrative. At one time, I thought of listing the distinctive characteristics of the account that John provides, the things that he includes not found elsewhere, the things that he excludes that are found in the Synoptic Gospels. But then I thought on reconsideration that might put the emphasis on the wrong place, on distinctiveness, rather than on the flow of the individual narrative that carries its own weight. So I'm simply going to work through these 2 chapters with you, and pausing now and then to draw attention to things that really should not be missed. This first section, chapter 18, 1 to 27, I've called Jesus Arrested and Disowned. By disowned, I mean to include 3 things. First, Jesus betrayed by an apostle, 18, 1 to 5. Jesus abused by the authorities, 20 to 23, slapped around for telling the truth. And third, Jesus denied by an apostle 3 times. But the themes are intertwined. It's not as if you have section A, Jesus arrested, section B, Jesus disowned. Rather, they go back and forth. So, 18, 1 to 14, Jesus arrested, the arrest narrative with a focus on Jesus. B, 18, 15 to 18, Peter's denial with a focus on Peter. Then C, 18, 19 to 24, more of the arrest narrative with a focus on Jesus. And then the last 3 verses, 25 to 27, D, Peter's denial with a focus on Peter. And yet, this is so typically John. It is so interwoven that the narrative as a whole is really all about Jesus. It's misleading to say this chunk is about Peter. It's about Jesus arrested and disowned. The effect is that he is the only figure in the narrative who faces the events with integrity, with innocence, with courage. Everyone else, whether friend or foe, succumbs to deceit, fear, lies, betrayal. The first section, verses 1 to 14. We begin, when he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. Well, in the context, the prayer that he finished praying was that reported to us in John 17, where Jesus prays predominantly for his own glory, that he might be glorified. Then in that framework, he prays for his own disciples, that they may be one as he and the Father are one. Then he prays for those who will become his disciples for worldwide mission, so that the glorification of the Son, for which he prays, is to be accomplished precisely through the unification of his disciples and the reaching out of the gospel to the whole world. And when he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples, crossed the Kidron Valley, and heads off to be crucified. As if to say that the answer to Jesus' prayer is precisely his death. After all, that's the means by which he is glorified. As we'll see a little later on, John plays with the theme of glorification. On the one hand, he is to be glorified with the glory that he had with the Father before the world began. On the other hand, he is lifted up to that ascension by being lifted up on the cross. He is glorified in shame. He rules in death. He draws disciples in by going to the cross. Here you have a narrative presentation of Paul's utterance. He preaches Christ crucified. So he crosses the Kidron Valley and comes to a garden, not named. And there's no mention here of the Gethsemane prayer with which we are familiar from the synoptic accounts. If it be possible, take this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will. There's no mention of that. Nor is there mention of the disciples sleeping. On the other hand, it's not as if the themes represented by those two events, Jesus' Gethsemane prayer and the disciples sleeping, are left out. There is plenty of shame for the disciples in John's narrative. It just focuses on a few extra details. And if the prayer of Gethsemane ends in Jesus' resolution to go to the cross, it's that resolution that drives chapters 18 and 19. We'll see it later this morning, and we'll see it very strongly tomorrow morning. Verses 2 to 3 makes us at least it makes someone with a mind as cynical as mine ask, why on earth was Judas needed to point out who Jesus was? In all four Gospels, there is an emphasis on the role of Judas as the betrayer. But after all, at this stage, doesn't everybody know who Jesus is? What do you have to point him out for? Seems a bit artificial. Until you stop and remember that this was the days before cell phones, before newspapers, before photographs. So even if Jesus had been preaching up and down the country, how many people knew what he looked like? Oh, of course, in Sunday school materials, he's the one with a white kimono. So you can spot him pretty clearly. All the rest have colored ones or striped ones of some sort or another. But Jesus is the guy in the white kimono. But if you eliminate that distinction, then how many people knew what he looked like? If there's a good crowd, how well do you see the figure at the front? In a day without a lot of people wearing spectacles, because spectacles hadn't been invented yet. On a dark night when there were no street lights, no lights from the city bouncing off low-hung clouds to form a kind of misty illumination down on the earth. None of that. Somewhere along the line, somebody's got to make sure they arrest the right man. And Judas was designated. And so we're told, Jesus is resolute, verse 4, knowing all that was to happen to him. And thus, by facing it boldly and walking into it, he is, in effect, bringing it about. Mark that. We'll come back to it again and again. Jesus brings about or fulfills or obeys his Father to bring about the plan, even while evil is happening all around him. We'll have cause to think about that, especially tomorrow and the next day. Thus, instead of fleeing the cross, as the prayer of Gethsemane indicates, that is not recorded here, the acting out of the Gethsemane prayer is presented here. He knows what's going to happen to him, and he walks into it resolute. Verses 5 and 6 are amongst the most intriguing in all of John's Gospel, certainly amongst the most intriguing in the Passion narrative. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas, the traitor, was standing there with them. No mention, incidentally, in John's Gospel of the traitor's kiss. The traitor's role is transparently wicked. One does not need to include the kiss. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. What is going on here? Is this a theophany? God manifesting himself in the person of his Son, causing these people to fall before Jesus in some kind of whimsical adoration? The trouble with that, of course, is that they haul themselves off the ground and promptly arrest him. I mean, if they really thought that what they were seeing was some manifestation of the glory of God, you'd think that the wonder would have lasted a wee bit longer. And so we come to this expression, "I am he." For the many, many, many of you who have preached through John's Gospel, you will know as well as I that the expression is simply egoimi. I am. But I am, in the right context, can mean I am he, or I am the one we're talking about. I am the subject of this conversation. Yet in the right context, it becomes a way of saying, I am the I am. I am the very manifestation of God. I take to myself the name of God already clearly established in Exodus 3 and elsewhere. The expression egoimi keeps showing up, especially in the prophecy of Isaiah. And the different uses are striking. 3 quite different uses. Here they are. Isaiah 41:4. "Who has done this and carried it through, calling forth the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, with the first of them and with the last." Egoimi in the Greek Septuagint. I am he. I am the one I've been talking about, the one who has brought these things to pass. 43:10. "You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, so that you may know and believe me and understand that egoimi." Well, to render that I am he sounds a bit artificial. You're not quite sure what the he refers to. I think that one really should be rendered in English idiom, "so that you may know and believe me and understand that I am," which is not simply the name of God, but it is establishing God's matchless, unique, independent existence. God is. Same chapter, a few verses farther on. "You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, that I am God. Yes, from the Ancient of Days, egoimi. I am he in that context means I am the God to which I've just referred. But it's God who has just been identified who is saying, I am he. So it's hard to distinguish from the absolute I am. Isaiah 46:4. Even to your old age and gray hairs, ego eimi. I am. I am he who will sustain you. I have made you and will carry you. I will sustain you and will rescue you. Now, if those things had been put in the opposite order, you'd want to render the I am he. In other words, if God had disclosed himself by saying, I have made you, I will carry you, I will sustain you, I will rescue you. Indeed, I am he. That is the one who will do all of these things. You would understand the ego mean to carry that weight. But in fact, the I am precedes all of these characteristics. Even to your old age and gray hairs, I am. And then he fills it out, I am he who will sustain you, and so forth. Isaiah 47, verse 8. Now this one is striking. Now listen, you lover of pleasure, lounging in your security and saying to yourself, ego eimi. Now it's the wicked people of God who are saying, I am. They are not claiming to be God in some profound ontological sense. But functionally, that's just about what they are claiming. I am. It's the same sort of stance that you find already in Genesis 3. God knows that if you eat of this fruit, you will be like God. What an intoxicating temptation. To be like God and get away without punishment. So I lounge around and have another drink and put my feet up and make sure the music's on and think to myself, I am. You're not dealing with deep philosophy here. You're dealing with cheesy idolatry. I am the center of the universe. I am who I define myself to be. I am who I identify myself to be. I am. So over against God's I am stands the I am of the sinner. God have mercy on us. So what is happening here? Whom are you trying to arrest? Whom do you want to see? Jesus of Nazareth. Ego eimi. Now, in the immediate flow, that really has to mean I'm the one you're looking for. It really has to mean that. So the question is, why did they fall down? If this is not a strict theophany, and if the natural way of reading ego eimi is to take it to mean something like, I am he, I'm the one you're looking for, then why is there falling down? Until you remember John's subtlety. I can't be sure this is correct, but I think it is. If you've ever visited Gethsemane, you know that it's on the slopes. It's stiff ground, some of it. They've come around, there's no light. They've come with a group of servants and soldiers, probably not, incidentally, Roman soldiers. We're told that some soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees came, verse 3. There were temporal soldiers, not a disciplined Roman square, just a few lay troops that guard the temple outlets, plus some officials, not much more than a nasty bit of mob. And Jesus steps forward in their face and says, I am. And they stumble in the dark and trip. Someone falls back and 2 or 3 others fall. It's probably not more than that, except for 2 things. Number 1, John frequently in his gospel points out that people say and do things better than they know. He's about to mention Caiaphas. And Caiaphas was introduced to us in chapter 11, where in the wake of Jesus raising from the dead of Lazarus, some people go and rat on Jesus to the religious authorities. A squabble breaks out in the Sanhedrin as to what to do with this troublemaker. And Caiaphas bursts out saying, "You bunch of ninnies, don't you understand it's better for one man to die than that the nation perish?" Thinking that Jesus would raise a rabble that would bring down the might of Rome upon their heads. John comments, he spoke that year as high priest. And in fact, he ultimately was referring to the people whom Jesus would save by dying in their place. Not only of his own people, but of his own people from around the world. Caiaphas spoke better than he knew. I think here John, witness to the scene, sees the people fall back, and afterwards contemplates what egoe can mean, and thought, this bunch of marauding riffs acted better than they knew. He doesn't spell it out. He's too subtle a writer for that. The second bit of evidence is that John himself has, of course, used egoe earlier. In John 6, on the walking of the water, Jesus identifies to himself to the frightened disciples, John 6:20, egoe, don't be afraid. And in the context, it almost certainly means simply, it's I. Don't be afraid. But with a hint of who the I is, who is saying it is I, which becomes abundantly clear 2 chapters later when Jesus says, before Abraham was, egoe. Then you simply cannot hold back from overhearing the God of Isaiah 43:10 speak. You are my witnesses, declares the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, so that you may know and believe me and understand that I am. Before Abraham was, Jesus says, I am. Very doubtful that the soldiers picked up on that at the time. But John reporting that they speak, they react, they stumble better than they know. He sees weight in Jesus' utterance. And all of this, in the first instance, is not, in Jesus' mind, first and foremost, a declaration of his ontology, of his very being. Rather, verses 8 to 11, it's a declaration of his role as the one who fulfills Scripture by safeguarding his own followers. He safeguards his own followers from the political conditions that threaten them right at the moment as a kind of acted parable of how he saves and preserves his followers in every dimension. And so we read, I told you that I am. If you are looking for me, then let these men go. That is, I am the one you're looking for. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me. That harks back to John 10, the Good Shepherd, and elusively to John 6. So he fulfills Scripture, he safeguards his own people. And verse 11, Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Is a working out of what we saw already in verse 4, knowing all that was going to happen to him. He went out and asked them, who is it that you want? That is to say, he is arrested because he was betrayed by his own disciples. And far from wanting help by a drawn sword, which was doubtless aiming for Malchus's neck, even though it achieved the slicing off of his ear, showed how far off Peter was from understanding what was going on. Verse 12. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. I should mention, I suppose, in passing, that some critics have said this proves that John's gospel is impossibly late when he's detached from the history of the time. He's acting as if the high priestly office was exercised for 1 year and then passed on to somebody else. He was high priest that year. Nobody in the first century could have said that. John's gospel has to be at the earliest, the beginning of the second century. But although under Jewish law that was correct, it forgets that the Romans sometimes actually simply ordered people in and out of the office. As far as the Jews were concerned, Annas was still the high priest. And they bring Jesus, first of all, to Annas, as we'll see in a few moments, verses 19 and following. And then bring him to Caiaphas, verse 24, the high priest that year. That year probably means something like not that ordained year as sanctioned by the Roman force, but rather that fateful year, that year in which Jesus the Messiah was arrested and crucified. So who was high priest depended on your point of view. From the Roman point of view, Caiaphas was high priest. From the Jewish point of view, Annas was still high priest. He hadn't died yet. It was supposed to be a lifelong office. And both are referred to as high priest in our chapter. It does not reflect a loss of historical touch with the first century. It reflects rather exactly what was going on in the first century with all of its confusion. So Jesus is arrested. He is betrayed by his own. Now in the second section, verses 15 to 18, he is disowned by his own. Peter and another disciple are introduced, the other disciple probably, but not certainly, being John. And we are told they are following Jesus. But how are they following him? Peter was ready to wield a sword, verse 10, but not to share in Jesus' suffering and disgrace. It would be a long time before he understood. There are some forms of Christian profession that are happy with Christian boldness, with attack, with military defense. But what does that look like when you're following the one whose way takes you to the cross? How different is Peter's stance in Acts chapter 5? The apostles at that point have been arrested a number of times, but have so far escaped battering. But at last, he is battered. And we read, then the disciples rejoiced because they were counted worthy to suffer for the name. That way of thinking is simply outside his categories at this juncture. If you're going to stand up for the Messiah, draw your sword. But Jesus is not coming with a sword at this juncture. Elsewhere we read that he could have called 12 legions of angels, but he's not coming with 12 legions of angels. He could have relied on his disciples and used his miraculous powers to flay the crowd left and right. But knowing all the things that were happening to him, he crossed the Kidron Valley and went to the garden where he would be identified and arrested, disowned even by his own followers. To put it a little differently, Peter preferred the warmth of the fire with Jesus' opponents to being out in the cold with Jesus. Verse 18, it was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire that they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. And that, of course, is what led to the question being asked of him. He couldn't imagine at this juncture being associated with Jesus because Jesus wouldn't even allow him to draw a sword. But he's comfortable with the warmth from the opponent's fire. And so the denial begins. Verse 17. You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. Not I am, but I am not. Section 3, verses 21 to 23. 19, I suppose, to 23. Clearly, the high priest in verse 19 is Annas. And then later he is taken in verse 23 to Caiaphas. Jesus responds to Annas' questions by insisting he has not been propagating esoteric teaching. If you're worried about my teaching, that I'm rabble-rousing, that I'm saying something that could bring down the Roman hordes, check it out for yourself. I haven't been in some little corner, hidey hole, manufacturing a conspiracy. Check it out for yourself. The drama unfolds. He's slapped across the face. How dare you answer the high priest in this way? A typical political move, questions of substance subordinated to questions of protocol. Which Jesus finds to be out of line with the truth. If I said something wrong, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And finally, we're back to Peter. Still warming himself by the fire. Here there are two more cycles of wretched denial, including before a relative of Malchus. Verse 26. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow, already predicted by Jesus in 13:38. Now let me tease out what we should take away from our study so far. 3 things. Number 1, the narrative unfolds with all of its inevitability, its predictability. So who is really in charge? If somebody from another planet, even from another continent, came in and looked at the scene and tried to analyze what was going on and where the convective powers of authority really lie, I think they would argue that they lie with the Roman government, they lie with the priestly aristocracy, they lie with the mobs, they lie in the Synoptic Gospels with Herod. They don't lie with Jesus. He doesn't have a chance. But already the narrative is being told in such a way as to emphasize that Jesus is resolutely going to do what was supposed to happen to him. So who's in charge? And that theme becomes stronger and stronger through the rest of this chapter and all of the next chapter, as we'll see. What brought Jesus to the cross? Oh, at one level, you can say it was the betrayal by Judas. At another level, you can say it was the malice of the authorities. It was even the cowardice of Peter, who didn't stand up for him in the courtyard. But the narrative unfolds with all of its inevitability, its predictability, and gradually you see that the whole narrative is actually about Jesus doing his Father's will. And thus it becomes a kind of acting out of the prayer of Gethsemane. Why does Jesus pray what he prays in the Gethsemane prayer? Does he say, oh, you've got to let me go to the cross, my dear Heavenly Father, because I love them so much. I really want to save them. No. Basically, he says, don't really want to go. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. The most fundamental reason why Jesus goes to the cross is because he's come to do his Father's will. And that will of the Father is, in John's Gospel, most transparently seen in the so-called high priestly prayer of John chapter 17, which introduces John's passion narrative. Having prayed this prayer, Jesus resolutely sets his face to cross the Kidron Valley, where he faces arrest, betrayal, torment, crucifixion, and death. He's come to do his Father's will. Now, do not misunderstand me. Not for a moment am I suggesting that Jesus does not love us, that his love for us is not one of the reasons that drive him to the cross. But it's not as if that's basically the heart of the issue. The heart of the issue is to do his Father's will, and the Father's will is this plan of redemption that drives Jesus to the cross precisely to draw in a vast number of disciples that in turn bring glory to the Son, as the Son is glorified by being lifted up on the cross and thus lifted up through ascension to the Father's right hand in the majesty on high. There are sweeping allusions here, cross-entangled themes that bring us back to the glory of the shame of the cross. Second, the narrative unfolds in such a way that following Jesus means more than sitting by comfortable fires. It means more than displays of physical courage, lopping off an ear if necessary. It means owning Jesus on the way to the cross. And here Peter and everybody else failed miserably. Here is precisely the blindness of the so-called health, wealth, and prosperity gospel. It wants the powerful Jesus, but not the Jesus who is heading on the way to the cross. It hears the blessings of God and wants an over-realized eschatology to bring them all in right now. The ultimate healing, the ultimate wealth, the ultimate resources of those who are called children of God, royal heirs. But it forgets that to secure these things, Jesus went to the cross. And he says to his disciples, "Take up your cross daily and follow me." Hence, for the reader of the New Testament who ponders the passion narratives, it's not surprising to find the Apostle Paul writing to the Philippians in his first chapter, "It has been granted to you," that is, graciously given, "it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ not only to believe on his name, but also to suffer for his sake." Oh, yes, we like to remind ourselves that faith has been granted to us. We are saved by grace through faith, and that, not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. It has been granted to you on behalf of Christ to believe on his name. But not only to believe on his name, but also to suffer for his sake. And I suspect that that is a lesson that the Western world has got to come to grips with a lot more than it has. For many of us have been grateful, in some measure or other, for the Judeo-Christian elements that have filtered through our culture at one level or another, sometimes pretty imperfectly, but nevertheless they've been there. And now they're disappearing. It's possible for some of us to respond by saying, "They have taken away my culture, and I know not where they have laid it," instead of rejoicing because we're counted worthy at last to suffer for the name. And finally, the narrative unfolds beyond these two chapters. Now, I've not been asked to expound all of John's gospel, but it would be an injustice to these two chapters to fail to see some of the links between these two chapters and what happens next. Now, some of those links we'll tease out tomorrow, but we ought to pause and think of Peter. Peter returns in chapter 21. Peter the failure. Peter the courageous coward. Peter the sword-swinging unbeliever. Peter who's ashamed of Jesus. I wish I could tell you that I've never been ashamed of Jesus. I don't know how many people are in this room, but I'd be prepared to bet quite a lot if I were a betting man that every single one of us has been ashamed of Jesus sometime. So that if all we had in John's gospel was the passion narrative, we'd be in a pretty desperate way. But this gospel ends up with Peter recommissioned. Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Shepherd my lambs. And even then, Peter is a bit immature. You tell me that I'm going to suffer a martyr's death. What about this dude? You know, this guy who's following us? Probably John himself who's writing the narrative. What about him? Basically, Jesus tells Peter, none of your business. If I want him to last until the parousia, what's that to you? You follow me. Those are lessons that flow out of Peter's failure in the passion narrative. And they are lessons that must come and comfort us with the simple truth that the Christ who resolutely goes to the cross is not finished at that point with his disciples, but still works out all of his good purposes for the glory of the Son, for the good of his blood-bought people. Amen.